I'll never forget her exact words as she stood in our conference room, announcing to the entire team that she had just closed the biggest deal in our company's history. After 15 years of building Sterling & Associates from the ground up, I'm thrilled to announce that Pinnacle Corporate Solutions has acquired us for $47 million. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Hyacinth Sterling, my mentor, my boss, and the woman who had promised me partnership just 6 months earlier, smiled like she'd won the lottery, which, I guess she had. What she didn't mention was that my partnership agreement had mysteriously vanished from the sale documents. What she didn't know was that the non-compete clause she thought would silence me forever. I never actually signed it. 5 years of 80-hour weeks, 3 major client acquisitions worth $12 million, and countless late nights building her dream, all about to become the foundation for the most satisfying revenge in corporate history. Because sometimes, the best contracts are the ones you never sign. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat there in that glass conference room on the 32nd floor of the Thornfield Business District, watching my entire future crumble with each word that came out of Hyacinth's mouth. The Seattle skyline stretched behind her like a backdrop to my personal nightmare. All those gleaming towers suddenly feeling like prison bars. This acquisition represents not just financial success, Hyacinth continued, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing to the presentation screen, but validation of everything we've built together as a team. Together. The word hit me like a physical blow. I glanced around the room at my colleagues. Blair Finch from operations was practically bouncing in her seat. Era Croft from business development had tears of joy in her eyes, and our junior associates were already calculating their severance packages. Everyone was celebrating, and here I was, feeling like I was witnessing my own funeral. 6 months earlier, Hyacinth had called me into her corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive abstract art. She'd poured 2 glasses of that ridiculously expensive whiskey she kept for special occasions and looked me straight in the eye. "Dahlia," she'd said, using the tone that had mentored me through 5 years of grueling growth, "I want to offer you something that's been a long time coming. Partnership. Full partnership, effective January 1st. I remember my hands actually shaking as I reached for that whiskey. Partnership at Sterling & Associates wasn't just a title. It was everything I'd worked for since graduating top of my class from business school. It meant equity. It meant decision-making power. It meant my name on the door of the most prestigious management consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest. 20% equity to start, she'd continued, with the opportunity to increase based on performance. You've earned this, Dahlia. Your client retention rate is 96%. You've brought in more revenue than any associate in the company's history. And frankly, I can't imagine building the future of this firm without you as my partner." I'd practically floated home that night, calling my parents, my best friend, even my ex-boyfriend, just to share the news. Partnership. At 31 years old, I was going to be a partner in one of the most respected firms on the West Coast. But now, sitting in this conference room listening to Hyacinth detail the terms of a sale that apparently had been in negotiation for months, I realized that future had been a mirage. The partnership paperwork I'd been waiting for never materialized. The January 1st date came and went with excuses about legal complications and timing issues. "The transition will be seamless," Hyacinth was saying, clicking to another slide. "Pinnacle has assured us that all current employees will be retained, and our client relationships will remain intact under their expanded service umbrella. All current employees, not partners, employees." I felt my phone buzz against my leg and glanced down to see a text from Blair. "Holy shit, we're all about to be rich. Drinks after this meeting? Rich." Everyone else was about to get acquisition bonuses and severance packages. Meanwhile, I was sitting here as an employee instead of a partner, which meant I'd get exactly what my employment contract specified, nothing beyond my regular salary, and maybe a small retention bonus. The math was simple and devastating. As a promised partner with 20% equity, I should have been looking at nearly $10 million from this sale. Instead, I was looking at maybe $50,000 in bonuses if I was lucky. "Now I know some of you might be wondering about your futures," Hyacinth continued, and for just a moment her eyes met mine across the table. "Pinnacle has asked that all senior staff sign updated non-compete agreements as part of the transition. These will be distributed after this meeting." Non-compete agreements, of course. The final nail in the coffin. Not only was I losing my partnership, but they were going to make sure I couldn't even use the experience and client relationships I'd built to start competing with them. I thought about all those late nights I'd spent in this building, working until 2 or 3 in the morning on client presentations while Hyacinth went home to her mansion in Bellevue. I thought about the Meridian account, a pharmaceutical company I'd personally courted for 8 months, flying to their headquarters in Chicago 6 times on my own dime before they finally signed a $3 million consulting contract. I thought about the Apex merger I'd guided through from initial due diligence to final closure, earning the firm $4.7 million in fees. I thought about the weekend I'd spent at the office during my sister's wedding, because Hyacinth had convinced me that the Nexus project couldn't wait. Partners sacrifice for the firm, she'd said. That's what separates them from employees. Employees. That's all I'd ever been to her, wasn't it? A very profitable employee. The meeting was wrapping up now, with everyone exchanging hugs and congratulations. Hyacinth was beaming, accepting thanks and praise like she'd personally delivered Christmas morning to each and every one of us. As people started filing out, chattering excitedly about severance packages and new opportunities, I remained seated, staring at my notepad where I'd unconsciously written Partnership 1-1 over and over again in increasingly angry strokes. Dahlia. Hyacinth's voice cut through my thoughts. Could you stay behind for a moment? The room emptied, leaving just the two of us surrounded by empty coffee cups and the lingering scent of celebration. The Seattle afternoon sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the conference table. I know this might come as a surprise, she began, her tone shifting to something that might have been apologetic if I hadn't known her better. The opportunity came up quickly, and the timing with your partnership agreement was unfortunate. Unfortunate. 5 years of my life, reduced to unfortunate timing. I want you to know that in the new structure, you'll have opportunities for advancement, she continued. Pinnacle recognizes talent, and they're very interested in retaining our top performers. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in 5 years, I saw her clearly. The mentor I'd idolized, the woman I'd worked myself to exhaustion for, the person I'd trusted with my career and my future, was just another executive protecting her own interests. What about our agreement? I asked quietly. What agreement? Her response was so smooth, so practiced, that I knew this conversation had been rehearsed. That's when I realized something that would change everything. Hyacinth Sterling might have just made the biggest mistake of her professional life. Because while she was planning to lock me into a non-compete agreement, she had no idea that the partnership contracts she'd been dangling in front of me for months contained some very specific language about intellectual property and client relationships. More importantly, she had no idea that I'd never actually signed the preliminary non-compete she thought was already binding me. I stood up slowly, gathering my notepad and pen with deliberate calm. Congratulations on the sale, Hyacinth, I said, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. I'm sure Pinnacle will be very happy with what they're acquiring. As I walked toward the door, I could feel her watching me, probably trying to gauge whether I was going to be a problem. She had no idea that the real problem wasn't my reaction to her betrayal. The real problem was what I was about to do next. I should probably tell you who I am before this story goes any further, because understanding my background is crucial to understanding why Hyacinth's betrayal cut so deep, and why my response was so calculated. My name is Dahlia Vance, and I'm 31 years old. Back then, I was the Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations at Sterling & Associates, the management consulting firm that had consumed the last 5 years of my life. But my story doesn't start in those glass towers in Seattle. It starts in a small town called Millbrook, Oregon, population 3,847, where my parents owned and operated Vance Hardware and Supply. Growing up, I spent my afternoons and weekends behind the counter of that store, learning lessons that Harvard Business School could never teach. My father, Silas Vance, was the kind of man who believed a handshake was more binding than any contract, and my mother, Gwen Vance, kept books so meticulous that the IRS used our records as examples during their training seminars. Business is about relationships, not transactions, my father would tell me as we helped farmers find the exact bolt they needed for their equipment, or when we stayed open late so Mrs. Beckham could get paint for her son's bedroom before his birthday. People remember how you treat them when they need you most. My mother's lessons were more pragmatic but equally valuable. Never sign anything you haven't read 3 times, she'd say, reviewing supplier contracts at our kitchen table after dinner. And always keep your own copies of everything. Trust people, but verify their words with paper. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These weren't just family mottos. They were survival strategies for a small business in a town where Walmart was always threatening to move in and crush everything we'd built. My parents had started with nothing but a small loan and determination, growing their business into the heart of our community through pure grit and integrity. I was the first person in my family to go to college, earning a full academic scholarship to Portland State University where I double majored in business administration and economics. I graduated summa cum laude with a 3.94 GPA, spending my summers working at my parents' store to pay for textbooks and living expenses they couldn't afford. But it wasn't enough for me. I'd grown up watching my parents work 16-hour days just to break even, and I was determined to build something bigger. I wanted to prove that someone from Millbrook could play in the major leagues, so I took the GMAT, scored in the 98th percentile, and earned a spot at the Wharton School of Business, one of the most prestigious MBA programs in the country. Wharton was culture shock beyond anything I could have imagined. My classmates drove cars that cost more than my parents' annual revenue. They talked casually about family vacation homes in the Hamptons and ski chalets in Aspen, but I'd learned something valuable growing up in that hardware store. Everyone needs something, and if you pay attention, you can usually figure out what that is. What my wealthy classmates needed was someone who understood real business, not just theory, but the practical mechanics of making things work. While they were networking at cocktail parties, I was in the library, analyzing case studies and developing frameworks that actually solved problems. My professors noticed, my grades reflected it, and by graduation, I had job offers from McKinsey, Bain, and 3 other top-tier consulting firms. But I chose Sterling & Associates instead, and here's why. Hyacinth Sterling herself had come to recruit at Wharton, and her pitch was different from everyone else's. She didn't talk about prestigious clients or starting salaries. She talked about building something meaningful. Most consulting firms are about extracting value, she'd said during her presentation. We're about creating it. We work with companies that want to grow sustainably, treat their employees well, and make a positive impact on their communities. We're not just consultants, we're partners in building better businesses. That resonated with everything my parents had taught me. This wasn't just about making money, it was about helping businesses become the kind of companies I'd grown up respecting. I started at Sterling & Associates as a junior analyst, the lowest rung on the ladder, but I climbed fast. Within 6 months, I was leading client presentations. Within a year, I was managing entire project teams. By year 2, clients were specifically requesting me for their accounts. My approach was different from the typical consultant playbook. Instead of coming in with predetermined solutions, I spent time understanding each business from the ground up. I worked alongside frontline employees, analyzed operational inefficiencies, and developed strategies that actually worked in the real world, not just in PowerPoint presentations. The Meridian Pharmaceutical account was my first major breakthrough. They were a mid-sized company struggling with supply chain inefficiencies that were costing them millions in delayed shipments. Previous consultants had recommended expensive software solutions and organizational restructuring. I spent 2 weeks working in their warehouses and discovered the real problem was a communication gap between their procurement and logistics teams that could be solved with simple process changes and better reporting systems. My solution saved them $2.3 million in the first year and increased their delivery reliability by 47%. More importantly, it didn't require laying off a single employee, something the previous consultants had insisted was necessary. Word spread. Soon I was being requested for increasingly complex projects. The Apex Industries merger, where I guided 2 competing manufacturing companies through a successful consolidation while preserving both company cultures. The Nexus retail transformation, where I helped a struggling chain modernize their operations without losing their small-town identity. Each success built my reputation, but more than that, it reinforced my belief that business could be a force for good when done right. I wasn't just climbing the corporate ladder. I was proving that the values my parents had instilled in me could work on a larger stage. Hyacinth noticed, of course. She started including me in strategy meetings, asking for my opinion on firm direction, treating me like the partner she would eventually promise to make me. I thought I'd found not just a mentor, but someone who shared my vision of what business could be. You're different from other consultants, she told me during my 4th-year review. You care about the people inside the businesses, not just the numbers. That's rare in our industry, and it's exactly what Sterling and Associates needs to stay relevant. I believed her. I believed that merit mattered, that hard work would be rewarded, that promises meant something. I believed that the handshake deals my father had taught me to honor were the foundation of all successful relationships. I believed in Hyacinth Sterling, and I believed in the future we were building together. That belief was about to become the most expensive lesson of my career. Before I continue with this story and tell you exactly how I turned the tables on Hyacinth Sterling, I need to pause here for a moment. If you're invested in seeing how this corporate betrayal story unfolds, and trust me, it gets so much more satisfying than you might expect, please hit that like button right now. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell, because I share stories like this regularly, and you don't want to miss what happens when people underestimate someone who's been systematically documenting everything. But here's what I'm really curious about. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. And more importantly, have you ever been in a situation where someone promised you something significant? A promotion, a partnership, equity in a business, or even just proper credit for your work, only to have that promise evaporate when it became inconvenient for them? Because as I've been sharing my story with people over the past few years, I've discovered that what happened to me isn't nearly as rare as I thought it was. In fact, it's epidemic. Just last month, I received an email from a woman in Toronto who had spent 3 years building a marketing agency with her supposed business partner, only to discover that the incorporation papers listed her as an employee while her partner held all the equity. Another message came from a software developer in Austin who had been promised 10% ownership in a startup after working for equity for 2 years, only to be pushed out right before their Series A funding round with nothing but a standard employment termination letter. The pattern is always the same. Someone in power makes promises to secure your dedication and hard work, then conveniently forgets those promises when fulfilling them becomes expensive or inconvenient. They count on your professionalism, your fear of burning bridges, your concern about your reputation in the industry to keep you quiet while they profit from your contributions. What most of these people don't realize is that the very qualities that make someone worth betraying, attention to detail, strategic thinking, relationship building skills, and yes, the tendency to document everything, are exactly the qualities that make them dangerous to cross. See, here's what Hyacinth Sterling didn't understand about the person she'd just betrayed. Growing up in a small business taught me that successful people always have backup plans. My mother didn't just keep meticulous books for the IRS, she kept them because she understood that in business, your word might be your bond, but paper is your insurance policy. During my 5 years at Sterling and Associates, I hadn't just been working hard and trusting blindly. I'd been building relationships, documenting processes, and yes, keeping my own very detailed records of everything. Every client interaction, every strategic decision, every promise made, and every delivery completed. You see, when you grow up watching your parents fight to keep a small business alive in a world designed to crush small businesses, you learn to think several moves ahead. You learn that information is power, that relationships are currency, and that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is, if you've ever felt like you're the only person this kind of thing happens to, you're not alone. Corporate betrayal, partnership fraud, and promise breaking are more common than anyone wants to admit. The difference is usually that most people don't have the tools, the evidence, or the strategic mindset to do anything about it. Most people just take the hit, update their resume, and move on to the next opportunity, hoping it will be different. I wasn't most people. Now, before I tell you exactly what I discovered in those first few hours after Hyacinth's announcement, and it's going to shock you, I want you to think about something. Think about the last time someone made you a promise that really mattered. A boss promising you a promotion, a business partner promising you equity, a client promising you a long-term contract. Did they put it in writing? Did you keep copies of the conversations? Did you document the work you did based on that promise? Because here's what I learned in the most expensive way possible. In business, good intentions are worthless, verbal promises are dangerous, and the only thing that matters is what you can prove. The beautiful irony of my situation, and you'll understand why I call it beautiful in just a few minutes, was that Hyacinth Sterling had spent 5 years teaching me to be meticulous, strategic, and always thinking 3 steps ahead. She had personally trained me to document everything, to build comprehensive case files for our clients, and to never make assumptions about what other people were thinking or planning. She had created the perfect weapon to use against herself. But the real kicker? The thing that was about to turn this from a simple story of corporate betrayal into something much more satisfying? Hyacinth had made one crucial assumption about me that was completely wrong. She assumed that because I was young, because I came from a small town, because I'd been grateful for her mentorship, I would be easy to intimidate and silence. She assumed that her non-compete agreements and corporate lawyers would be enough to keep me from becoming a problem. She had no idea that the small-town girl she'd been mentoring had been paying very close attention to every single thing she'd been taught, including the legal loopholes, the industry connections, and yes, the importance of reading every single document before you sign it. Remember earlier when I mentioned that my mother always said never sign anything you haven't read 3 times? Well, it turns out that sometimes the most powerful contract is the one you never sign at all. Over the next few parts of this story, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I used Hyacinth's own tactics against her, how I turned her clients into my allies, and how one overlooked detail in a contract she thought I'd signed became the foundation for the most satisfying professional victory of my career. But first, I need to tell you about what I discovered when I went back to my office that evening, and why everything Hyacinth thought she knew about our relationship was about to change forever. So stick around, keep that notification bell turned on, and get ready for a masterclass in strategic patience and corporate chess, because sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting mad. Sometimes, the best revenge is getting everything. I managed to hold it together until I reached my office. The moment I closed the door behind me, the professional mask I'd been wearing for the past hour finally cracked. My office was on the 29th floor, 3 floors down from the executive suites where Hyacinth held court, but it still had a decent view of Elliott Bay. I'd always loved that view, especially during late nights when the city lights reflected off the water like scattered diamonds. It represented everything I'd worked for, the proof that a girl from Millbrook, Oregon could make it in the big leagues. Now it just felt like a prison cell with expensive furniture. I sank into my chair and stared at my desk, trying to process what had just happened. The mahogany surface was organized exactly the way I liked it, client files stacked by priority, my laptop positioned at the perfect angle, a small succulent plant that somehow survived despite my frequent business travel. Everything looked normal, but nothing would ever be the same. That's when I noticed the envelope. It was sitting in my inbox, pristine white with the Sterling & Associates letterhead, marked Confidential Dahlia Vance. My hands were shaking as I opened it, though I already knew what it would contain. The non-compete agreement was 15 pages of dense legal language, but I'd learned to read contracts the way my mother had taught me, slowly, carefully, and with extreme skepticism. As I scanned through the clauses, my blood pressure kept rising. Employee agrees not to directly or indirectly engage in any business that competes with Sterling & Associates for a period of 3 years following termination of employment. Employee acknowledges that client relationships developed during tenure belong exclusively to Sterling & Associates. Employee agrees that any proprietary methodologies, processes, or strategic frameworks developed during employment remain the intellectual property of Sterling & Associates. 3 years. They wanted to lock me out of my own industry for 3 years, while also claiming ownership of every strategy, every process, every relationship I'd built. It was professional assassination disguised as legal protection. But then I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. At the bottom of the last page, where my signature should have been, there was just a blank line. No signature, no date, no notary stamp. I rifled through my desk drawers, searching for any other copy, any version I might have signed and forgotten about. Nothing. I checked my email for any electronic signature requests. Nothing. For the first time since the meeting, I felt something other than despair. I felt hope. A knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called, quickly sliding the contract under a folder. Blair Finch stepped in, closing the door behind her with the careful precision of someone about to say something they shouldn't. Blair was our director of operations, a sharp woman in her 40s who had been with Sterling & Associates for almost as long as Hyacinth. If anyone understood the politics of this place, it was her. "How are you holding up?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I'm fine," I lied, but Blair's expression told me she wasn't buying it. "Dahlia," she said gently, "we need to talk. What happened in that meeting? It wasn't right." Those words broke something loose inside me. "She promised me partnership, Blair," 6 months ago, she looked me in the eye and promised me 20% equity. I've been working toward that partnership for 5 years. Blair nodded grimly. I know. I was in the executive committee meeting where she proposed it. She said you were the future of the firm, that your client relationships and strategic thinking were irreplaceable. She paused, studying my face. She also said the partnership paperwork was being drafted and would be finalized by January. What changed? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The acquisition talks started in September, Blair said quietly. Pinnacle approached her directly. Once she saw those numbers, well, partnerships become expensive complications when you're trying to sell a company. The math was simple and brutal. A $47 million acquisition was life-changing money for Hyacinth personally. My 20% partnership would have meant nearly $10 million coming out of her sale proceeds. From her perspective, why give up $10 million to honor a promise when she could just claim the promise never existed? Did she think I wouldn't remember? I asked. Did she think I wouldn't have documented any of this? Blair's eyebrows shot up. You documented the partnership discussions. I gestured to my filing cabinet. Blair, I document everything. Every meeting, every promise, every strategic decision. It's how I was trained. I paused, realizing something important. It's how she trained me. Smart girl, Blair said, but her expression was troubled. Dahlia, I need to tell you something else. This isn't the first time she's done this. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Before you joined the firm, there was another senior VP named Kira Stone. Brilliant strategist, amazing client relationships, worked here for 7 years. Hyacinth promised her partnership right before we landed the Valdris Industries contract, our biggest client at the time. Then she suddenly decided Kira wasn't partnership material and brought in her cousin instead. What happened to Kira? She left the industry entirely, couldn't compete because of the non-compete agreement she'd signed. Last I heard, she was teaching business classes at a community college in Portland. The pattern was clear now. Hyacinth Sterling had a system: identify talented people, promise them partnerships to secure their loyalty and maximum effort, then find reasons to renege when honoring those promises became inconvenient. She was a predator who fed on other people's ambition and hard work. But she'd made one crucial mistake with me. Blair, I said carefully. Hypothetically speaking, if someone had never actually signed a non-compete agreement, even though their employer assumed they had, what would that mean legally? Blair stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her putting the pieces together. Hypothetically speaking, it would mean that person would be free to pursue any opportunities they wanted, including competing directly with their former employer. And if that person had documented evidence of promises that were broken, and client relationships that were built through their personal efforts, hypothetically, Blair said, a slow smile spreading across her face, that person would be holding a very powerful set of cards. We sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the implications of what we were discussing. What are you thinking, Dahlia? Blair asked finally. I looked out at that view of Elliott Bay, thinking about everything Hyacinth had taught me over the past 5 years: strategic thinking, long-term planning, the importance of understanding your leverage before making any moves, building relationships that would serve you when things got difficult. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that Hyacinth Sterling spent 5 years training me to beat her at her own game. She just doesn't know it yet. Blair leaned forward. What do you need? That question told me everything I needed to know about Blair's loyalties. She wasn't just offering sympathy, she was offering alliance. And in corporate warfare, allies were everything. For now, I need you to keep this conversation between us, I said. And I need to know everything you can tell me about the Pinnacle acquisition. Timeline, terms, key decision-makers, everything. I can do that, Blair said. But Dahlia, be careful. Hyacinth has been playing this game a lot longer than you have. Maybe, I said, feeling something crystallize inside me. Not anger, but cold, calculated determination. But she taught me well, and she made one very big mistake. What's that? I pulled the unsigned non-compete agreement from under the folder and held it up. She assumed I was as naive as her previous victims. As Blair left my office, I turned back to my computer and opened a new document. If Hyacinth wanted to play games with contracts and promises, I was going to show her what someone with 5 years of Sterling & Associates training could accomplish when they stopped playing by rules that were designed to protect only one player. It was time to start building my own game, And this time, I was going to make sure I held all the cards. That night, I stayed in the office until nearly midnight, but I wasn't wallowing in self-pity or frantically updating my resume like everyone probably expected. Instead, I was doing what Hyacinth had trained me to do best, building a comprehensive strategic plan. The first rule of consulting that she drilled into me was simple: never make assumptions, always gather data, analyze the situation from every angle, and identify all the variables before making any moves. If I was going to take on someone with Hyacinth's experience and resources, I needed to approach this like the most important consulting project of my career. I started with what I called my asset inventory. On a whiteboard in my office, I mapped out everything I had working in my favor. First, the unsigned non-compete agreement. This was my ace in the hole, but I needed to be careful about how and when to play it. If Hyacinth discovered I'd never signed it too early, she might try to force me to sign a new one, or find other ways to neutralize the advantage. Second, my documentation. 5 years of meticulous record-keeping had given me something invaluable: a complete paper trail of every project I'd led, every client relationship I'd built, and every strategic innovation I'd contributed to the firm. More importantly, I had documented evidence of Hyacinth's partnership promises, including email chains and meeting notes that clearly showed her commitments. Third, my client relationships. This was perhaps my most valuable asset. In consulting, clients don't hire firms, they hire people. The trust and rapport I'd built with key accounts like Meridian Pharmaceutical, Apex Industries, and Nexus Retail weren't transferable to Sterling and Associates. They were personal relationships that I'd cultivated through years of delivering exceptional results. Fourth, my reputation in the industry. My success rate spoke for itself, and in a field as relationship-driven as management consulting, reputation was currency. I'd spoken at industry conferences, published articles in trade journals, and built a network of contacts who knew my work firsthand. But assets alone weren't enough. I needed to understand Hyacinth's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The biggest weakness was one she didn't even realize she had: her own arrogance. Hyacinth had become so accustomed to being the smartest person in the room that she'd stopped considering the possibility that someone else might be playing a longer game. She assumed that her employees were either too grateful, too scared, or too naive to challenge her effectively. The second weakness was structural. Sterling & Associates had grown rapidly over the past 5 years, largely due to my client acquisitions and strategic innovations, but that growth had created dependencies that Hyacinth hadn't fully considered. Several major clients had specifically requested me for their accounts, and their contracts included provisions for key personnel changes. If I left, they had the right to terminate their agreements. The third weakness was the most interesting: the Pinnacle acquisition itself. I'd done enough merger and acquisition consulting to know that deals of this magnitude were incredibly sensitive to disruption. If key clients started questioning the transition, or if Pinnacle discovered that Sterling & Associates' growth was more dependent on individual talent than they'd been led to believe, the entire sale could be jeopardized. With my strategic analysis complete, I began developing what I privately called the Liberation Protocol. Phase 1 was about intelligence gathering. I needed to understand the exact terms of the Pinnacle acquisition, the timeline for completion, and the specific representations Hyacinth had made about the firm's stability and key personnel. Blair had already agreed to help with this, and her position in operations gave her access to information I couldn't get directly. Phase 2 was about positioning. Instead of confronting Hyacinth or making dramatic gestures, I was going to be the perfect employee right up until the moment I wasn't. I would attend the transition meetings, smile during the corporate announcements, and give every appearance of accepting the new reality. Meanwhile, I would be documenting everything and carefully strengthening my relationships with key clients. Phase 3 would be about timing. The moment had to be perfect, not so early that Hyacinth could recover and damage control, but not so late that the acquisition was finalized and my leverage evaporated. I estimated I had about 6 to 8 weeks before the Pinnacle deal closed. Phase 4 was the execution phase, and it would depend on what I learned during the first 3 phases, but I already had some ideas about how to turn Hyacinth's own tactics against her. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I wasn't going to do anything illegal, unethical, or even particularly aggressive. I was simply going to use the truth, documented, verifiable, and impossible to deny, at exactly the right moment to maximum effect. But first, I needed to start gathering the intelligence that would make everything else possible. I pulled up my client contact list and began drafting what appeared to be routine check-in emails. "Hi Sarah," I typed to my contact at Meridian Pharmaceutical. "I wanted to personally reach out following today's announcement about Sterling and Associates' acquisition. I know transitions can be uncertain, so please don't hesitate to contact me directly if you have any questions or concerns about how this might affect our ongoing projects." Similar messages went out to my contacts at Apex Industries, Nexus Retail, and 4 other major accounts. On the surface, they were simple client service emails. In reality, they were early warning systems that would alert me if Pinnacle or Hyacinth tried to marginalize my role in these relationships. Next, I began organizing my documentation. Every email, every meeting note, every project proposal was sorted chronologically and backed up to multiple secure locations. I created detailed spreadsheets showing my direct contribution to each major client acquisition, including the revenue generated and the specific strategies I'd developed. Most importantly, I began documenting the partnership promises with surgical precision. The initial conversation in Hyacinth's office, the follow-up emails about finalizing paperwork, the executive committee discussions that Blair had mentioned, everything was compiled into a comprehensive timeline that would be impossible to dispute. By 1 a.m., I had the foundation of a strategy that would either secure my future or destroy my career. There was no middle ground with a plan like this. If I was wrong about any of my assumptions, if I'd misread Hyacinth's vulnerabilities, if the timing was off by even a few days, I could find myself blacklisted from the industry entirely. But as I looked at the evidence spread across my desk, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Hyacinth's announcement: confidence. Not the naive confidence I'd had in the partnership promise, but the hard-earned confidence that comes from thorough preparation and strategic thinking. Hyacinth Sterling had taught me to be meticulous, patient, and always thinking 3 moves ahead. She'd trained me to build unshakable cases based on documentation and evidence. She'd shown me how to leverage relationships and timing to achieve objectives that seemed impossible. Now I was going to show her what happens when those lessons are applied by someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The student was about to become the teacher, and class was about to begin. The first test of my strategy came exactly 3 days later, and it revealed something that made my heart race with possibility. Sarah Martinez from Meridian Pharmaceutical called me directly on my cell phone at 8:47 a.m., bypassing the main Sterling and Associates number entirely. That alone told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalties lay. "Dahlia," she said without preamble, "I got your email about the acquisition, and I need to ask you something directly. Are you staying with the firm through the transition?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. My response would either strengthen a crucial relationship or potentially expose my plans prematurely. I chose my words carefully. "I'm committed to ensuring all our ongoing projects are completed successfully," I said, which was technically true while revealing nothing about my long-term intentions. "Why do you ask?" "Because frankly our board is concerned. We've been working with Sterling and Associates for 2 years, but our relationship has always been with you specifically. Your strategic insights saved us $2.3 million, and your project management kept us on track during our expansion. If you're not going to be our primary contact going forward," she didn't need to finish the sentence. In consulting, client retention was everything, and Meridian was one of Sterling and Associates' top 3 accounts worth $1.2 million annually. "I appreciate that confidence," I told her. "Can I ask if you've had any communication from Pinnacle about account management changes?" "That's actually why I'm calling. Yesterday we received a transition memo saying that all client relationships would be seamlessly maintained under Pinnacle's expanded service model. It was signed by someone named Torvin Beckett, who we've never heard of. The memo didn't mention you at all." My blood pressure spiked, but I kept my voice steady. "I haven't seen that memo yet. Would you be willing to forward it to me?" "Already done. I sent it to your personal email 10 minutes ago." The fact that she'd used my personal email instead of my corporate account told me that Sarah was thinking strategically too. Smart clients always maintained backup channels of communication with the people who actually did the work. After we hung up, I immediately checked my personal email and felt my first real surge of vindication. The memo was exactly what Sarah had described: a generic transition document that completely ignored the relationship-based nature of consulting work. More importantly, it revealed that Pinnacle was planning to replace key Sterling and Associates personnel with their own people. Torvin Beckett wasn't just some random name. A quick LinkedIn search revealed he was Pinnacle's Director of Client Services, a corporate yes-man with no consulting experience who specialized in streamlining service delivery, consultant speak for cutting costs and reducing personalized attention. I forwarded the memo to Blair with a simple message. Thoughts? Her response came within minutes. Holy shit. They're planning a complete takeover. Emergency coffee meeting in 20 minutes. Lobby cafe. 20 minutes later, Blair and I sat in the corner of the building's cafe, surrounded by the morning rush of ambitious professionals grabbing overpriced lattes before their meetings. But our conversation was anything but routine. I've been digging into the acquisition terms, Blair said quietly, stirring her coffee with unnecessary precision. It's worse than we thought. Pinnacle isn't just buying Sterling and Associates. They're buying the client contracts and planning to integrate everything into their existing service model. What does that mean for personnel? It means Hyacinth gets her $47 million, a few senior people get retention packages, and everyone else gets job interviews for positions that may or may not exist. Blair's expression was grim. The integration plan calls for right-sizing the workforce by approximately 40%. 40%. Nearly half the people I'd worked with for 5 years were about to lose their jobs, while Hyacinth walked away with more money than most of them would earn in their entire careers. There's more, Blair continued. I managed to get a look at the client portfolio valuation. Guess which accounts were listed as the highest value and most stable? I didn't need to guess. Mine, Bingo, Meridian, Apex, Nexus, and your other major accounts represent 68% of the firm's total recurring revenue. The acquisition is essentially Pinnacle buying your client relationships. The irony was staggering. Hyacinth was selling my work, my relationships, and my strategic innovations for $47 million while giving me nothing. But she was also making a fundamental error that revealed just how little she understood about the business she'd built. Blair, what happens to the acquisition if those high-value accounts become unstable? She smiled grimly. The purchase agreement includes standard representations and warranties about client retention. If significant accounts terminate within 90 days of closing, Pinnacle can reduce the purchase price or potentially void the deal entirely. That was the opening I'd been looking for. Given that your accounts represent 68% of the total, she let the math speak for itself. I felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the cafe's espresso. If even a quarter of my major accounts decided they weren't comfortable with the transition, it could jeopardize the entire acquisition. But I needed to be careful. Too aggressive a move could backfire spectacularly. Instead, I decided to test the waters with one strategic client interaction. That afternoon, I scheduled a routine project review call with the CEO of Nexus Retail, a client I'd worked with for 3 years. During our conversation about Q4 performance metrics, I casually mentioned the acquisition. We're excited about the additional resources Pinnacle will bring to our partnership, I said, following the corporate script perfectly, though I know transitions can sometimes create uncertainty. Actually, Dahlia, I'm glad you brought that up, the CEO responded. We received a memo yesterday about account management changes, and it raised some concerns for our board. You've been instrumental in our digital transformation strategy, and frankly, we're not comfortable with the idea of starting over with someone new. I completely understand that concern, I replied. Obviously, I'm committed to ensuring continuity for all our ongoing projects. Good to hear. Between you and me, if this transition means losing you as our primary contact, we'll need to seriously reconsider the relationship. Nothing personal against Pinnacle, but you know our business better than anyone, and we can't afford to lose that institutional knowledge during our expansion phase. After the call, I sat back in my chair and smiled for the first time since Hyacinth's announcement. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I'd hoped. My clients weren't just loyal to Sterling and Associates, they were loyal to me personally, and they were willing to act on that loyalty if necessary. But the real validation came that evening when my phone rang with a call from an unexpected source. Lachlan Wild, managing partner at Blackwood Strategic, one of Pinnacle's biggest competitors. Dahlia, he said after we'd exchanged pleasantries, I heard about the Sterling and Associates acquisition, and I wanted to reach out. Your reputation in this industry speaks for itself, and I'd love to discuss some opportunities we might have for someone with your track record. That's very flattering, Lachlan, but I'm focused on ensuring a smooth transition for my current clients. Of course, but if circumstances change, I hope you'll consider us. We're expanding our West Coast operations, and we could use someone who understands the market the way you do. We're talking about a significant leadership role with full equity participation. Full equity participation. The words hit me like a physical blow, reminding me of everything Hyacinth had promised and taken away. But they also reminded me of something else. I had options. Real options, with real equity, at firms that understood my value. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my first week of testing had revealed three crucial pieces of information. My clients were more loyal to me than to the firm, the acquisition was more fragile than it appeared, and I was more valuable in the marketplace than Hyacinth had ever acknowledged. The foundation was set, the pieces were in position, and Hyacinth Sterling had no idea that the game had already begun. The validation I'd been hoping for came from an unexpected source, and it arrived with the force of a corporate earthquake. 2 weeks after the acquisition announcement, I received a call that would change everything. It was Thursday morning, and I was reviewing quarterly performance reports when my assistant buzzed through. "Dahlia, there's a Gwen Sterling on line 1. She says she's calling about the Pinnacle acquisition." Gwen Sterling, Hyacinth's older sister and the co-founder of Sterling & Associates, though she'd stepped back from daily operations 5 years earlier to focus on her venture capital firm. I'd met her only a few times at company events, but she'd always struck me as someone who paid close attention to details that others missed. "Gwen," I said, accepting the call, "this is a surprise." "Hello, Dahlia. I hope you don't mind the direct call, but I needed to speak with someone I trust about what's happening with the company." Her voice was crisp, professional, with an undertone that suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. "Of course. How can I help?" "I've been reviewing the acquisition materials that Hyacinth provided to Pinnacle, and I noticed some interesting discrepancies. According to these documents, the firm's growth over the past 5 years has been attributed primarily to innovative leadership strategies and executive vision. But when I look at the actual client acquisition records and revenue generation, a different picture emerges." My heart started racing, but I kept my voice neutral. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The kind that suggests someone is taking credit for work they didn't do." There was a pause. "Dahlia, I'm going to be direct with you. I've been tracking this firm's performance since I stepped back, and I know exactly who's responsible for our major client wins. The Meridian acquisition, the Apex merger consultation, the Nexus transformation. Those were your strategies, your client relationships, your results." I was speechless. In all my time at Sterling & Associates, no one in senior leadership had ever acknowledged my contributions so directly. "I also know," Gwen continued, "that Hyacinth promised you partnership. It was discussed in executive committee meetings that I still attend as a board observer. What I didn't know until yesterday was that this partnership was never formalized and that you're not receiving any equity consideration in the acquisition." "How did you find out?" "Because I asked for the partnership distribution schedule as part of my due diligence review. When I discovered there were no junior partners listed, I started asking more pointed questions." Her tone hardened. "Dahlia, what my sister has done is not just unethical, it's potentially fraudulent. She's selling assets you created while representing to Pinnacle that these were firm assets developed through executive leadership." The word fraudulent sent a chill through me. This was bigger than a broken promise or corporate betrayal. If Gwen was right, Hyacinth had misrepresented the source of the firm's value to secure a $47 million deal. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that Pinnacle believes they're acquiring a firm driven by executive innovation and leadership continuity. They don't know that the actual value driver, you, has no equity stake and no guarantee of staying with the company post-acquisition." Gwen paused. "They also don't know that several major clients have already expressed concerns about the transition." My pulse quickened. "You know about the client concerns." "Dahlia, I still sit on the boards of 3 companies that contract with Sterling & Associates. The CEOs talk to each other, and word travels fast in our industry. There's growing anxiety about whether the quality of service will be maintained under Pinnacle's management." This was the external validation I'd been hoping for, but it was coming faster and more powerfully than I'd anticipated. Industry leaders were already questioning the acquisition, and someone with Gwen's reputation and connections was taking notice of the fundamental problems with how it had been structured. "Gwen, can I ask why you're telling me this?" "Because I built this company alongside Hyacinth 15 years ago, and I refuse to watch her destroy it through greed and dishonesty." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched a partnership deteriorate. "Also because I believe in recognizing talent where I find it, and you represent the best of what we tried to build here." "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should understand your value and act accordingly. I also think you should know that if you decide to pursue other opportunities, you'll have support from people who matter in this industry. That afternoon, the external validation continued from an entirely different direction. Iris Beckett, editor of Pacific Business Journal, called my direct line. Dahlia, I'm working on a feature story about the changing landscape of management consulting in the Pacific Northwest, with a focus on the recent consolidation trend. Your name keeps coming up in my interviews as someone who's been driving innovation in the field. That's flattering, Iris, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to comment on industry trends. Actually, you might be exactly the right person. I've been talking to CEOs and CFOs at major companies, and several mentioned your work specifically. Sarah Martinez at Meridian Pharmaceutical said your strategic framework saved them millions and should be taught in business schools. The CEO of Nexus Retail called your transformation strategy the gold standard for retail innovation. My head was spinning. These weren't just polite compliments, these were the kinds of endorsements that could define a career. I'm also hearing interesting things about the Sterling and Associates acquisition. Iris continued. Some industry observers are questioning whether Pinnacle understands what they're actually buying. There's concern that the value they're paying for is more dependent on individual talent than the acquiring company realizes. I couldn't comment on internal business matters, I said carefully. Of course, but I wanted you to know that your reputation in this industry is significant, and people are paying attention to how this transition unfolds. If you ever want to discuss your perspective on consulting innovation or industry best practices, I'd love to feature your insights. As I hung up the phone, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. External validators, people with no stake in my conflict with Hyacinth, were independently recognizing both my value and the problems with the acquisition structure. The narrative was building organically, without any manipulation from me. That evening, Blair stopped by my office with a printed email that made everything crystal clear. This came through the executive distribution list an hour ago, she said, handing me the document. From Pinnacle's integration team. The email detailed Pinnacle's 90-day transition plan, and it was exactly what I'd feared. Key Sterling and Associates personnel would be evaluated for fit within Pinnacle's service delivery model. Client relationships would be systematically transferred to Pinnacle account managers. And most telling of all, legacy consulting methodologies will be reviewed and integrated into Pinnacle's proprietary framework. They weren't just acquiring Sterling and Associates, they were planning to strip mine it, take everything of value, and dissolve what remained into their corporate machine. There's one more thing, Blair said. I heard from a contact at Pinnacle. They're surprised that Sterling and Associates doesn't have more detailed documentation about key client relationships and strategic methodologies. They expected more proprietary assets for a $47 million acquisition. I almost laughed. The proprietary assets were sitting in my filing cabinet and my laptop. The strategic methodologies existed in my head and my personal files. The client relationships lived in my phone contacts and email history. Hyacinth had sold them a shell company and convinced them they were buying the Pearl, but the Pearl was walking out of the building with me at the end of each day, completely unaware of its own value until now. The external validation was complete. Industry leaders, journalists, and even Pinnacle themselves were beginning to question the fundamental assumptions underlying this acquisition. It was time to move to the next phase. The first sign that Hyacinth was starting to realize she had a problem came on a Monday morning 3 weeks after the acquisition announcement. I was in my office reviewing client reports when my assistant buzzed through with an unusual request. Dahlia, Hyacinth wants to see you in her office immediately. She said to drop whatever you're working on. Immediately. That word choice told me everything I needed to know about her state of mind. In 5 years of working together, Hyacinth had never used language that urgent unless there was a crisis. I took the elevator to the 32nd floor, my mind racing through the possible scenarios. Had she discovered my conversations with Gwen? Did she know about the client concerns? Had Pinnacle started asking uncomfortable questions? Hyacinth's corner office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd built a $47 million company. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, original artwork that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, and furniture that screamed success without saying a word. But today, the woman behind the massive mahogany desk looked anything but victorious. "Sit down," she said without looking up from her computer screen. Her tone was ice-cold, and I noticed her hands were gripping her mouse with enough force to make her knuckles white. I settled into the chair across from her desk, maintaining the same professional demeanor I'd perfected over the past few weeks. "You wanted to see me." She finally looked up, and I was startled by what I saw. The composed, confident executive I'd known for 5 years looked haggard. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her usually perfect makeup couldn't hide the stress lines around her mouth. "I've been getting some interesting phone calls," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "Calls from clients asking questions about the transition. Calls from industry contacts wondering about our staffing structure. Calls from Pinnacle expressing concerns about representations I made during the acquisition negotiations." I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds concerning." "It is concerning, Dahlia, especially when these calls all seem to center around one common theme: uncertainty about whether key personnel will be retained post-acquisition." Her eyes narrowed. "Personnel like you." "I haven't spoken to anyone about leaving the firm," I said, which was technically true. I hadn't spoken about leaving because I hadn't decided whether that was my best strategic move. Maybe not directly, but somehow word is getting out that the primary relationship manager for our most valuable accounts might not be staying with the company. "Do you have any idea how that might be happening?" I could see the trap she was setting, so I chose my words carefully. "Clients are naturally concerned during transitions. When they ask me directly about my plans, I tell them I'm committed to ensuring project continuity. Beyond that, I can't control what they infer or who they talk to." "And what about my sister?" There it was. Gwen had made her move, and Hyacinth knew it. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Gwen called me yesterday asking very detailed questions about partnership agreements and equity distributions. Questions that suggest someone has been providing her with information about internal firm matters." Hyacinth leaned forward. "Information that you, as someone who was considered for partnership, would have access to. Hyacinth, if Gwen has concerns about the acquisition structure, perhaps you should address those concerns directly with her. As a co-founder, she has legitimate reasons to ask those questions." "Don't play games with me, Dahlia." Her voice was rising now, the controlled facade starting to crack. "I know exactly what's happening here. You're upset about the partnership situation, so you're trying to sabotage the acquisition by creating instability with our clients and feeding information to potential opponents." "That's a serious accusation," I said calmly. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "I have evidence that you've been having unauthorized communications with clients about matters beyond your scope of responsibility. I have evidence that confidential internal information has been shared with parties outside the firm, and I have evidence that your actions are directly contributing to the problems we're now facing with Pinnacle." I felt a surge of adrenaline, but not fear, anticipation. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, and Hyacinth was reacting exactly as I'd predicted. When threatened, she became aggressive and made mistakes. "Hyacinth, every communication I've had with clients has been documented and appropriate. If you'd like to review my client interaction logs, I'm happy to provide them. As for confidential information, I'd be interested to know specifically what you're referring to." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her calculating whether to escalate further. Finally, she pulled out a folder from her desk drawer. "As of today, you're being reassigned. You'll be transitioning all client responsibilities to Torvin Beckett from Pinnacle's team. Your new role will be focused on internal operations and documentation review." Internal operations and documentation review. Corporate purgatory. She was trying to sideline me, cut me off from client contact, and neutralize my influence during the critical final weeks of the acquisition. "I see," I said, "and what's the timeline for this transition?" "Immediate. You'll spend the remainder of this week briefing Torvin on your current projects, and then you'll move to your new responsibilities." "Hyacinth, with respect, several of my clients have specifically requested continuity during the transition period. Moving me away from those accounts abruptly could create exactly the kind of instability you're concerned about. That's a risk we'll have to take." Her tone was final. "Dahlia, I'm going to be very clear with you. This acquisition is happening. It's going to be successful, and anyone who tries to interfere with that success will find themselves on the outside looking in, regardless of their history with this firm." The threat was unmistakable, but it was also a fundamental miscalculation. By trying to isolate me from clients, she was actually proving their point about the importance of relationship continuity. By attempting to marginalize me, she was validating every concern that had been raised about the acquisition structure. "I understand," I said, standing up. "Should I schedule the transition meetings with Torvin for this afternoon?" He'll be in touch with you directly. As I walked toward the door, Hyacinth called after me. Dahlia, I hope you'll think carefully about your next moves. This industry is smaller than you might think, and reputations can be very fragile things. I turned back to face her. You're absolutely right, Hyacinth. Reputations are fragile things. They take years to build and can be destroyed in moments. I paused. I'm sure you'll keep that in mind as you navigate the next few weeks. The look on her face told me the message had been received and understood, but if Hyacinth thought that threatening me would end my strategic campaign, she was about to learn how wrong she could be. Within an hour of our meeting, I had received 3 calls that showed just how badly her approach was backfiring. The first was from Sarah Martinez at Meridian Pharmaceutical. Dahlia, we just received notice that someone named Torvin Beckett will be taking over our account management. What's going on? There are some organizational changes happening as part of the acquisition transition, I said diplomatically. We specifically chose Sterling and Associates because of the personalized service and relationship-based approach. Torvin Beckett called us this morning with what sounded like a standard corporate script. Is this representative of what we can expect going forward? I can't speak for Pinnacle's service philosophy, Sarah. You'll need to evaluate that for yourself. We will. And Dahlia? Thank you for everything you've done for us. Whatever happens with this transition, we won't forget who actually delivered results for our company. The second call was from Gwen Sterling, and her tone was Arctic. I just got off the phone with Hyacinth, she said without preamble. She's making a serious mistake by trying to marginalize you during the acquisition process. More importantly, she's creating legal exposure for the firm by misrepresenting the source of our key client relationships. What kind of legal exposure? The kind that happens when you sell someone assets you don't actually control. Pinnacle's purchase agreement includes specific warranties about client retention and relationship stability. If key accounts terminate because of personnel changes that weren't disclosed, Hyacinth could be looking at a breach of contract lawsuit. And you think that's a possibility? I think it's a probability if she continues down this path. Dahlia, I need you to know that if this situation escalates, you'll have support from board members who understand what's really happening here. The third call was perhaps the most significant. It came from Lachlan Wild at Blackwood Strategic. Dahlia, I'm hearing through industry channels that there might be some changes in your situation at Sterling and Associates. If you're interested in exploring alternatives, I'd like to discuss something substantial with you. What kind of alternatives? Partnership track, significant equity stake, and the opportunity to bring your client relationships with you. We've been watching your career, and frankly, you're exactly the kind of talent we want to build our West Coast expansion around. That's a generous offer, Lachlan, but I'd need to be very careful about any moves that might violate non-compete agreements. Of course, though I should mention that our legal team specializes in consultant mobility issues. If there were any questions about the enforceability of existing agreements, we have excellent resources to help clarify those matters. The message was clear. Blackwood Strategic had done their homework and knew about my unsigned non-compete agreement. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Hyacinth's aggressive response had actually accelerated my timeline and strengthened my position. By trying to silence me, she had created exactly the kind of dramatic personnel change that her clients feared. By threatening me, she had motivated potential allies to offer concrete alternatives. By attempting to marginalize my role, she had made it impossible for Pinnacle to ignore the fact that their acquisition was built on relationships they didn't control. Most importantly, she had forced me to make a decision I'd been postponing. It was time to stop reacting to her moves and start making my own. That evening, I sat in my office crafting 3 carefully worded emails that would change everything. The first was to my key clients, informing them of the organizational changes and providing my personal contact information for any questions about project continuity. The second was to Gwen Sterling, accepting her offer of support and requesting a meeting to discuss the legal implications of the current situation. The third was to Lachlan Wild, asking for a confidential discussion about partnership opportunities. Before sending them, I read each message 3 times, just as my mother had taught me to read contracts. These weren't just emails, they were the opening moves in the final phase of my strategy. As I hit send on the last message, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began. Complete clarity about what came next. Hyacinth Sterling thought she was fighting to save her acquisition. What she didn't realize was that she was actually fighting to save her reputation, her company, and possibly her freedom. The escalation phase was complete. The final confrontation was about to begin. The confrontation came exactly 2 days later, but not in the way I'd expected. I was in my office Thursday morning, ostensibly working on the documentation review that Hyacinth had assigned me, when Blair burst through my door without knocking. Her face was flushed, and she was clutching a printed email with hands that were visibly shaking. "Dahlia," she said, closing the door behind her with unnecessary force, "we have a problem. A big one." "What happened?" She thrust the paper at me. "This came through the executive distribution an hour ago, from Pinnacle's legal team." I read the email quickly, and my blood pressure spiked with each line. "Following our preliminary review of Sterling and Associates' client portfolio, we have identified several discrepancies between represented assets and actual contract structures. Specifically, we note that several high-value client relationships appear to be dependent on individual personnel rather than firm-wide capabilities. We are requesting immediate clarification on key personnel retention guarantees and may need to reassess certain valuation assumptions." "They know," Blair said simply. "Somehow, Pinnacle figured out that the clients aren't really Sterling and Associates' assets, they're yours." "How did they find out?" "That's the thing. I don't think anyone told them directly. I think they started doing deeper due diligence after some of the clients began asking questions about the transition, and they realized that their $47 million purchase might not include what they thought it did." Before I could respond, my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed Hyacinth's extension. "My office. Now." Her voice was barely controlled fury before the line went dead. Blair and I looked at each other. "This is it," she said. "Whatever you're planning to do, it has to be now." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder I'd been preparing for exactly this moment. 5 years of documentation, carefully organized and cross-referenced, partnership promises, email chains, client testimonials, revenue attributions, and most importantly, legal documents that Hyacinth thought I'd signed but never actually had. "Blair, I need you to do something for me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If I'm not back in my office within 2 hours, I need you to send a specific email for me." I handed her a sealed envelope. "Everything you need is in there. Email addresses, attachments, the whole message. Can you do that?" She nodded grimly. "Dead man's switch. Smart." She paused. "Dahlia, whatever happens up there, remember that you hold all the cards. Don't let her intimidate you into forgetting that." The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt like an eternity. When I stepped into Hyacinth's office, I immediately realized this wasn't going to be a private conversation. Torvin Beckett from Pinnacle was sitting in one of the guest chairs, along with a woman I didn't recognize wearing an expensive suit that screamed corporate lawyer. "Sit down," Hyacinth said, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. I took the remaining chair, placing my folder carefully on my lap. "I understand there are some questions about the client portfolio." "Questions?" The lawyer spoke for the first time, her tone sharp and professional. "Miss Vance, I'm Corliss Hayes from Pinnacle's legal department. We're facing potential breach of contract issues that could void this entire acquisition. We need answers, and we need them now." Torvin Beckett cleared his throat. "Yesterday, 3 of Sterling and Associates' largest clients contacted us directly expressing concerns about service continuity. They've indicated that their contracts were structured around specific personnel relationships that weren't disclosed during the acquisition negotiations. Specifically," Corliss continued, "they've indicated that their primary relationship is with you personally, not with Sterling and Associates as an entity. This represents a fundamental misrepresentation of the assets we believed we were acquiring." I looked at Hyacinth, whose face had gone pale. "And what are you hoping I can do to address these concerns?" "You can start," Hyacinth said through gritted teeth, "by explaining why you've been undermining this acquisition by suggesting to clients that you might not be staying with the firm." "I've never told any client that I was planning to leave," I said calmly. "I've simply been honest when they've asked about the transition timeline and my role in the new structure." "Honest?" Hyacinth's voice was rising. "You've been deliberately creating uncertainty to sabotage this deal." "Actually," I said, opening my folder, "I've been documenting everything, just as you taught me." I pulled out a thick stack of papers. Email chains showing client concerns that began immediately after the acquisition announcement. Meeting notes from conversations where clients specifically asked about personnel continuity, and records showing that these concerns arose organically, not from any suggestions I made. Corliss Hayes leaned forward. May I see those documents? I handed her a copy of the client communication timeline. As she reviewed it, her expression grew increasingly troubled. Ms. Sterling, she said to Hyacinth, these documents suggest that client concerns about personnel retention began within days of the acquisition announcement. Were you aware of this pattern? Minor transition anxiety is normal in any acquisition, Hyacinth said dismissively. It doesn't represent a fundamental asset issue. Actually, Torvin interjected, it does. The contracts we reviewed specifically include key personnel clauses. If the primary relationship managers for these accounts leave within 90 days of the acquisition, the clients have the right to terminate without penalty. I watched Hyacinth's face as the implications sank in. If my major clients terminated their contracts, Pinnacle could claim that Sterling and Associates had misrepresented its asset base and demand a significant reduction in the purchase price, or potentially void the deal entirely. Which brings us to the critical question, Corliss said, turning to me. Miss Vance, what are your intentions regarding continued employment with the firm? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I reached into my folder and pulled out a document that made Hyacinth's eyes widen in recognition. That depends, I said, on whether my employment agreement actually requires me to stay. I placed the unsigned non-compete agreement on the coffee table between us. You see, I've been reviewing my contractual obligations and I've discovered something interesting. While I was provided with this non-compete agreement 3 weeks ago, I noticed that it was never actually executed. Hyacinth's face went from pale to ashen. You signed that agreement, Dahlia. It's part of your employment file. Actually, it's not. I pulled out another document, a certification from Sterling and Associates' own HR department. I requested a complete copy of my employment file yesterday, as is my legal right. This unsigned non-compete agreement was included in the file, but there's no executed version. Corliss Hayes took the document and examined it carefully. Sterling, do you have a signed copy of this agreement? Of course I do, Hyacinth said, but her voice lacked conviction. The signed version must be in a different file. I'm sure you'll locate it, I said smoothly, but in the meantime it appears that I'm not bound by any post-employment restrictions. Torvin Beckett was frantically taking notes. Ms. Vance, hypothetically speaking, if you were to leave the firm, what would happen to your client relationships? Hypothetically, I said, I suspect my clients would make decisions based on where they felt most confident about receiving quality service and maintaining continuity with the strategic frameworks we've developed together. And those strategic frameworks, Corliss asked, are they proprietary to Sterling and Associates? I smiled. That's an interesting question. Let me show you something else. I pulled out a copyright registration certificate from the U.S. Copyright Office, dated 6 months earlier. I've been developing a proprietary consulting methodology called the Integrated Value Framework. It's the foundation for the strategic approaches I've used with Meridian, Nexus, Apex, and several other major clients. The methodology is registered under my personal copyright, not as a work for hire for Sterling and Associates. The silence in the room was deafening. Hyacinth was staring at the copyright certificate like it might spontaneously combust. You copyrighted your work methodologies? She whispered. I copyrighted the intellectual property I developed on my own time, using my own resources based on frameworks I created before joining this firm, I said. All perfectly legal and ethical. Corliss Hayes was frantically flipping through her legal papers. Ms. Sterling, did your company agreements include intellectual property assignment clauses for employee-developed methodologies? They should have, Hyacinth said weakly. But they don't, I confirmed. I've had the agreements reviewed by intellectual property attorneys. Sterling and Associates has no claim to methodologies I developed independently. The full scope of the disaster was becoming clear. Pinnacle thought they were buying a firm with proprietary client relationships and strategic methodologies. Instead, they were buying a company whose primary assets walked out the door each evening in my briefcase and my head. Ms. Vance, Torvin said carefully, what would it take to ensure continuity for these client relationships and methodologies? I had been waiting for this question for 3 weeks. Well, I said, that would depend on what kind of partnership opportunity might be available. Hyacinth finally exploded. Partnership opportunity? You think you can blackmail your way into partnership by sabotaging this acquisition? Hyacinth, I said calmly, I'm not blackmailing anyone. I'm simply clarifying the actual ownership structure of the assets you've been selling. if Pinnacle is interested in acquiring those assets, they'll need to negotiate with the people who actually own them. I stood up, gathering my documents. I'll give you all some time to discuss your options. When you're ready to have a conversation about partnership equity that reflects the actual value I bring to this organization, I'll be in my office. As I reached the door, Corliss Hayes called after me. Ms. Vance, if you were to pursue opportunities elsewhere, how much notice would you be able to provide? I turned back with a smile. Given that I apparently have no contractual obligations restricting my movement, I suppose that would be entirely at my discretion. The last thing I saw before closing the door was Hyacinth Sterling's face, the expression of someone who had just realized that her $47 million payday had turned into a potential legal and financial nightmare. But I wasn't finished yet. The real confrontation was just beginning. The call came at 6:47 p.m. that same day, just as I was packing up my office for what might be the last time. It was Gwen Sterling, and her tone told me everything I needed to know. "Emergency board meeting in 1 hour," she said without preamble. "Executive conference room, your presence is requested." Am I being terminated? Quite the opposite. You're being offered a seat at the table where your future gets decided. She paused. "Dahlia, bring every piece of documentation you have. Tonight, we're going to settle this once and for all." An hour later, I walked into Sterling & Associates' executive conference room to find the most powerful collection of people I'd ever seen in one place. Gwen Sterling sat at the head of the table, flanked by the 3 other board members I'd only seen at annual company meetings. Across from them sat the Pinnacle contingent, Corliss Hayes, Torvin Beckett, and a distinguished man in his 60s who introduced himself as Elias Finch, Pinnacle's CEO. At the far end of the table, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, sat Hyacinth Sterling. "Thank you for coming, Dahlia," Gwen said as I took the only remaining chair. "We've spent the last 4 hours reviewing the situation, and we need to address several critical issues." Elias Finch spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Ms. Vance, our legal team has completed their analysis of the documents you provided today. It appears that Pinnacle's acquisition was predicated on several fundamental misunderstandings about asset ownership and personnel agreements. Misunderstandings that were created by misrepresentations," Gwen added pointedly, looking directly at her sister. Hyacinth shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "The situation is quite clear," Corliss Hayes continued, consulting her legal notes. "The client relationships we believed we were acquiring are primarily personal relationships built by Miss Vance. The strategic methodologies we valued at several $1 million are her copyrighted intellectual property, and the non-compete agreements we assumed would ensure personnel continuity were never actually executed. Which means," Torvin Beckett added grimly, "that we're potentially acquiring a consulting firm with no proprietary assets and no guarantee that our most valuable clients will remain with the company." I watched Hyacinth's face as the full scope of her miscalculation became clear to everyone in the room. She had tried to sell assets she didn't own, while assuming that promises and threats would keep the actual asset, me, locked in place. However, Elias Finch continued, turning to me, "We're not here to apportion blame. We're here to find a solution that works for everyone." Gwen Sterling leaned forward. "Dahlia, before we discuss Pinnacle's proposal, the board wants you to know that we've completed our own investigation into the partnership promises that were made to you. We've reviewed email chains, meeting notes, and executive committee minutes. Hyacinth's commitment to offer you 20% equity partnership was clearly documented and should have been honored." "Should have been, but wasn't," I said quietly. "Correct, which is why the board is prepared to make you a formal offer." She slid a document across the table. "Immediate partnership with 25% equity, retroactive to January 1st, full voting rights, seat on the executive committee, and your choice of title, managing partner or chief strategy officer." I picked up the document, scanning the terms quickly. It was everything I'd been promised and more, but before I could respond, Elias Finch cleared his throat. "With respect to the board's generous offer, Pinnacle would like to present an alternative proposal." He slid his own document across the table. "We're prepared to restructure this acquisition as a partnership merger. Sterling & Associates would become the West Coast division of Pinnacle, with you as division managing partner, 50% equity in the West Coast operations, guaranteed autonomy over client relationships and strategic methodologies, and a compensation package that reflects the actual value you bring to the organization." I looked at both offers, my mind racing. 6 months ago, a 20% partnership would have been a dream come true. Now I was looking at offers for 25% of Sterling and Associates or 50% of a division within a much larger organization. These are both generous offers, I said carefully. But before I can consider either one, I need to understand what accountability looks like for the misrepresentations that created this situation. The room went silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I kept my gaze fixed on Hyacinth. "Dahlia," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I made mistakes. I should have honored our partnership agreement. I should have been more transparent with Pinnacle about the structure of our client relationships." "Mistakes?" I said, my voice steady but unmistakably cold. "Hyacinth, you didn't make mistakes. You made calculated decisions to profit from my work while ensuring I received nothing. You threatened my career when I started asking questions. You attempted to marginalize me when clients expressed concerns. These weren't mistakes, they were conscious choices." Gwen Sterling nodded grimly. "Which is why the board has also made some decisions about leadership structure going forward." She turned to her sister. "Hyacinth, effective immediately, you're stepping back from day-to-day operations. You'll retain your equity stake and a seat on the board, but you'll no longer have executive authority over personnel decisions or client relationships." Hyacinth's face went white. "Gwen, you can't." "I can, and I am. This company was built on principles of integrity and merit-based advancement. Your actions over the past 6 months have undermined both of those principles." Elias Finch was taking notes rapidly. "And if Ms. Vance chooses to join Pinnacle's restructured offer, then Hyacinth will maintain her equity stake in the sale, but her role in any ongoing operations will be eliminated entirely," Gwen said firmly. I looked around the table at all the powerful people waiting for my decision. 6 months ago I would have been intimidated by this moment. Now I felt nothing but clarity. "I appreciate both offers," I said, "but I've actually been considering a third option." Everyone leaned forward. "Over the past few weeks I've had conversations with several industry leaders about launching an independent consulting practice. With my client relationships, proprietary methodologies, and the reputation I've built, I believe I can create something new and significant." Hyacinth looked like she might faint. "However," I continued, "I'm willing to consider the partnership restructure with one additional condition." "What condition?" Gwen asked. I looked directly at Hyacinth. "I want a formal acknowledgement, in writing, of my contributions to this firm's success over the past 5 years, not just for the record, but as part of any public communications about the restructuring. The industry needs to understand that success comes from recognizing and rewarding talent, not from exploiting it." "Done," Gwen said immediately. "And," I added, "I want assurance that this firm will implement policies to prevent future partnership fraud, clear documentation requirements, third-party oversight of equity agreements, and protection for employees who raise concerns about unfair treatment." "Also done." I looked at Elias Finch. "And from Pinnacle?" "Full autonomy over your division's operations, including hiring, client relationships, and strategic direction, plus a commitment to implementing similar accountability measures throughout our organization." For the first time in months, I smiled. "Then I think we have the foundation for a successful partnership." 3 hours later, I walked out of that conference room as managing partner of Sterling and Associates, with guaranteed equity, operational control, and most importantly, the public acknowledgement that merit and hard work would be rewarded. Hyacinth Sterling walked out with her $47 million sale intact, but with her reputation in ruins and her career effectively over. Justice, it turned out, wasn't just about getting what you deserved. Sometimes it was about making sure the system changed so that the next person wouldn't have to fight the same battle. As I sat in my car in the parking garage, I called my parents to share the news. When I told them what had happened, my mother was quiet for a long moment. "I'm proud of you, honey," she finally said, "but I'm not surprised. You always understood that the best contracts are the ones that protect everyone's interests, not just the person with the most power." She was right. The best victory wasn't defeating Hyacinth Sterling. It was building something better in her place. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my new corner office, the one that used to be Hyacinth's, writing this story for you. Sterling and Associates has become one of the most respected consulting firms on the West Coast, not because we're the biggest or the flashiest, but because we've built a culture where merit actually matters, and promises are actually kept. We've implemented the accountability measures I demanded: transparent partnership tracks, third-party oversight of equity agreements, and protection for anyone who raises concerns about unfair treatment. More importantly, we've inspired other firms in our industry to adopt similar policies. Sometimes change starts with one person refusing to accept the status quo. But this story isn't really about me, and it's not just about corporate consulting. It's about something much bigger: the power that comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let others profit from your work without acknowledgement or compensation. Since sharing this experience, I've heard from hundreds of people in similar situations. The software developer whose startup co-founder tried to push her out right before their IPO. The marketing professional whose agency took credit for her viral campaigns. The researcher whose university department head published her work under his name. The pattern is everywhere, across every industry, at every level. But here's what I've learned. These situations aren't hopeless. The same qualities that make you valuable enough to exploit, attention to detail, strategic thinking, relationship-building skills, and integrity, are exactly the tools you need to protect yourself and demand fair treatment. If you're watching this because you're in a similar situation, here's what I want you to remember. Document everything. Not because you're paranoid, but because you're professional. Keep records of your contributions, your conversations, and your commitments. The truth has power, but only if you can prove it. Know your value in the marketplace. Don't let anyone convince you that you're lucky to have what you've earned. Do your research, understand your worth, and never apologize for expecting fair compensation for excellent work. Build relationships outside your immediate workplace. Your network is your safety net. Cultivate connections with clients, industry contacts, and potential mentors who can validate your contributions when others try to minimize them. And most importantly, don't be afraid to use your leverage when you have it. The moment you start questioning the fairness of your situation is usually the moment when you have more power than you realize. The people who try to take credit for your work are counting on your professionalism, your fear, and your gratitude to keep you quiet. Don't let them. Your silence isn't noble, it's enabling them to do the same thing to the next person. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. I share content regularly about workplace advocacy, strategic career planning, and standing up for yourself in professional situations. But more than that, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when someone tried to take credit for your work or when you successfully stood up for yourself in a difficult situation. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. Remember, your work has value, your contributions matter, and no one can take away what you've earned unless you let them. The system only changes when individuals refuse to accept unfair treatment. Sometimes the best contract is the one you never sign. Sometimes the most powerful move is the one no one sees coming. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who changes everything. Your story matters, your work has value, and you have more power than you think. Now go use it. Trim our standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.